Hello, welcome back to the channel. This is a course on genetic diversity and adaptation. In this video, we're going to look at what genetic diversity is and why it's important and how it leads to adaptations through natural selection. So let's get into it. Okay, to start off, let's look at this image here. You can see all of these different organisms here and there, all members of the same species. So we say that they belong to the same population. And although they look similar, there are differences between their genes, their DNA. For example, one might have a gene for blue eyes, while another has a gene for brown eyes, while another has a gene for green eyes. All of these different versions of genes are called alleles. So in this case, there are 3 different alleles for eye color in this population. So now, let's define our key term, genetic diversity. Genetic diversity refers to the variety of genes within a species or a population. Now we can consider why genetic diversity is important by looking at this graph. On the x-axis here, we have the number of different alleles of a gene. On the y-axis, we have the number of individuals in a population that survive environmental changes. So if we go along here, we can see that the greater the number of alleles, the greater the number of survivors. Okay, so here's the question. Why does genetic diversity increase the chances of survival of a population? Well, consider this scenario here. We have a population of grass, or 2 different alleles, or 2 different versions of a gene for the height of the grass. So we have a short allele, and we have a tall allele. So we have 3 different genotypes. SS, which is homozygous dominant, so that's short. AS, which is heterozygous, so that's also short. And AA, which is homozygous recessive, so that's tall. Now imagine that a drought occurs, and we'll represent that by putting this line right here. Before the drought, we had 6 individuals of genotype SS, 3 of genotype AS, and 1 individual of genotype AA. After the drought, however, we see that the tall grass, the AA genotype, was advantageous because it could photosynthesize more efficiently. So now we have 5 individuals that survived. If we calculate the allele frequency after the drought, we will see that the frequency of the allele has increased from 1 out of 10 to 5 out of 10. So overall, population has more genetic diversity. Why is this important? Well, if we were to encounter another environmental change, perhaps a storm that uproots plants, well, then the AA genotype might not be advantageous anymore. But because there is more genetic diversity in this population now, because there's more alleles, there's a better chance that some of the genotypes will survive. Therefore, genetic diversity increases the chances of survival of a population. Now, let's move on and talk about adaptation. Remember that adaptation is a feature that makes an organism suited to its environment. For example, we can see this giraffe here that has a really long neck, and this allows it to reach high up into the trees and eat the leaves. That's an adaptation. So this giraffe is well adapted to its environment. Now, one reason why organisms have different adaptations is because they have different genotypes. Remember that genotypes are the different combinations of alleles, and those genotypes code for different phenotypes, which are the observable characteristics. So here's a great example of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Bacteria reproduce asexually by binary fission, which means that all of the bacteria are genetically identical. However, sometimes during reproduction, random mutations occur and a different allele is produced. For example, one mutation may cause a bacterium to produce a protein that blocks the action of an antibiotic. And so when we come and we put the antibiotic in, some of the bacteria are resistant and others are not. So in this case, we see that there's low genetic diversity. But there's a mutation that has occurred that created a new allele that confers antibiotic resistance. So now let's bring it all together and define natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which organisms with advantageous traits are more likely to survive and reproduce and pass on their traits to their offspring. So we can summarize this with this flowchart here. We begin with variation. So this is the different traits that exist in a population. Perhaps some moths are light-colored and some are dark-colored. Next, there needs to be a selection pressure. So in this case, we might have pollution that makes the light-colored moths stand out more against the dark trees. Next, those with advantageous traits survive and reproduce. So in this case, the dark-colored moths that are camouflaged will survive and reproduce. And then finally, the advantageous traits are passed on to offspring. And over time, we see that the frequency of the dark allele increases in the population. Let's watch this short clip here that demonstrates natural selection. Here we can see that there's a variety of beak shapes in these finches. So some are really long and thin, and others are really short and thick. There's various intermediate phenotypes as well. The environment on this island consists of only large, hard-shelled seeds, and so the finches with larger beaks are able to crack open the seeds and eat them. Therefore, the large beak finches are more fit. They are more likely to survive and reproduce than the finches with smaller beaks. And so over time, the frequency of the large beak allele increases in the population. Alright, so now let's do a quick practice exam question. Explain how meiosis contributes to genetic diversity. Pause the video here if you want to make a guess. Meiosis is the process of cell division that produces gametes, sperm, and egg cells. And during meiosis, there are two processes that increase genetic diversity. The first is crossing over, which is the exchange of genetic material between homologous chromosomes. And the second is independent assortment, which is the random distribution of maternal and paternal chromosomes into daughter cells. Now, as promised, let's finish up with a real-life example. Consider this population of moths here. We have a light-colored moth and a dark-colored moth. And before the Industrial Revolution, the light-colored moths were more common, and therefore the light allele was more frequent. However, during the Industrial Revolution, we had pollution that killed off many of the light-colored moths. And so now we have more dark-colored moths, and the dark allele becomes more frequent. Over time, we see that the environment changed, and this led to a change in the allele frequencies in the population. And this is an example of natural selection. And that's what we're going to explore next time, which is evidence for evolution. Now we're going to learn about fossils, homologous structures, and vestigial structures in biogeography, and how all of these provide evidence for evolution. So if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And as always, thanks for watching.